Hello and welcome back to the Be More Connected Summit. Today we have the wonderful Constanza Eliana Chinea with us. Hello, how are you?
Hi, good. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. And Constanza Eliana is the founder of Embody Inclusivity, and she is a Latinx certified yoga instructor who has a total of 10 years of experience in the industry and over 300 hours of training in yoga, trauma, and anti-racism. She began her teaching and consulting after noticing a need for diversity and representation in the industry, and she now teaches yogis and entrepreneurs how to decolonize their practice, create equity for teachers of color, and build inclusive spaces and community. Well, thank you again for being here. I'm so excited to dive into this conversation with you. And I love to start off these conversations with just learning a bit about your journey of healing and what's gotten you to where you are today.
I mean, my journey is one that might feel very similar to somebody who is an immigrant. So although I was born in the United States, I was raised in Puerto Rico with my Puerto Rican parents. After they graduated college, they moved back to their hometowns and raised me and my sister. So English is my second language. When we moved back to the United States, I was already about 8 or 9 years old. And so I really went through that experience of coming from an outside culture into a brand new culture, brand new language, and a brand new set of rules, like rules that I really had to learn. And so that kind of evolved my journey of, what it meant to self-assimilate out of survival and really try to change who I was as a person, as a child, so that I could fit into this new society that I was placed into. And so my journey of healing actually came after I chose to drop out of college and didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do or be, but I knew that there was some deep hurt and pain in my life that I was really trying to run away from. And I was self-medicating through alcohol. I was a binge alcoholic. And when I found yoga is really when that journey of, I guess, more self-awareness started to come about. I took up meditation as daily practice. I was also practicing yoga asana almost on a daily basis. And it was really more so a way for me to really face the issues that I was trying to run away from, face my past and all of the things that were really hurting me from my past, how I was going to move forward in the healing process to really take accountability for my own health and well-being. So that's kind of like the short background of what got me into just wellness in general. And of course, it's a lifelong journey. There are still things that I face every day that like anxiety. I am a person that is highly anxious, but very functioning anxious person. So there are things that I have to do every day to make sure that I don't spiral out of control. And yeah, some of the things from the past, like feeling less worthy than someone else. These are all things that I think are going to be like a lifetime practice for me to really heal from within. And wellness has become a huge part of that. Meditation and yoga has become a huge part of that liberation process.
Yes, and I so appreciate you presencing that importance of acknowledging that a lot of the lessons that we are experiencing in this lifetime are lifetime lessons, and that sometimes it takes many, many, many iterations of exploration and healing and seeking how to support ourselves in this journey of growth and evolution.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think also it's really good to note that there are different seasons in a person's life. So what works for me in this current moment in my life may not work 10 years from now. And so I really have to learn how to be more self-aware so that I can also evolve with the many different changes that are happening. And I think right now is a great example of having to adapt to the times, given we're in historic times with the pandemic and things are different. We're having to shift and mold not just our businesses, but also the way that we take care of ourselves. So we have to be flexible and understand that, you know, we never arrive in wellness. It's a continual practice.
100%. And would you mind sharing a bit about how that has looked for you in terms of expanding some of your self-care practices,
Yeah.
particularly as it relates to anxiety, because I know that is a collective emotion that's really surfacing for a lot of us.
Yeah, totally. Actually, this weekend, I chose to completely unplug and decompress, and chose to observe as much silence as I could. Typically, I would practice Vipassana meditation. And Vipassana meditation, for people who may not know what that is, it's a very specific way to practice, and a big part of it is observing silence. Um, and so it's really about going inward. And I chose to do that in self-isolation at home because I can't go anywhere. But the way that I adapted that practice was to really just allow myself to feel the anxiety that I was feeling, rather than to try and run away from it or to try and suppress it by being busy or staying busy or creating programs or offerings. I felt that it was a really good time for me to, in the self-isolation, to really start to go a lot more inward and not work, not, you know, be busy with like emails or Instagram. I really chose like 2 days, 48 hours of really just being with myself. And that was a really good practice, and I'm privileged enough to do that. I have I don't have children, so it was accessible for me to do that, but it was really essential to my mental health. I'm not a person that has the access or the ability to get a therapist, and so this was kind of my way of not allowing the anxiety to take over, where I was really starting to feel like it was really taking over. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, just the pandemic being what it is. So the way that my self-care practices have evolved is more so about being really in tune with how I'm feeling in the moment. And whatever I have access to is what I use. So if I have access to unplugging for 2 days, then I take that advantage. But even if it's just 1 hour out of the day or 30 minutes or even 10 minutes in between calls or meetings or in between recording things for my students, I teach a lot of online classes. There can be times and days where my self-care really looks like, let me make myself a smoothie, or let me grab some strawberries and mangoes, make a little fruit salad for myself, and enjoy that for the next 10 minutes. Not looking at my phone, not looking at emails, not doing anything for work, but really just like enjoying that bowl of fruit. So sometimes it looks like that. And I think that's the thing, is like, there's such a culture in wellness that like your self-care has to look like this, and it has to be really luxurious, and it has to take a lot of time, right? Like, but oftentimes we don't have that. Particularly for those people that live with a lot of people in their homes or have children, specifically little children, it can be really difficult to take a lot of time out. So that's kind of how I choose to do my own self-care practices. And then other times, like if I need guidance in meditation, then I have apps that have, you know, different teachers that can guide me through a meditation, because my anxiety is so loud that I can't, you know, guide myself into it. And so I think it's really important to also know yourself and what it is that you need in the moment. There's nothing wrong with, you know, pulling up an app and for 30 minutes being guided by somebody else who can hold that space for you, even virtually. So that's kind of what it looks like for me.
Beautiful. Knowing yourself, having a variety of tools, and really allowing yourself to tune in and listen to what your body and your soul are needing.
Yeah.
And I think that feels so aligned with the vision and the intention behind your work as well with Embody Inclusivity. And I'd love if we could dive a bit deeper into your work there and um, the inspiration behind what you've created.
Yeah, Embody Inclusivity was really born out of my experience in the yoga industry specifically. I started off volunteering at yoga studios because I really couldn't afford to buy the monthly passes, but I was so committed to my practice that I really wanted to keep going. So once my, Groupon pass initially for that first month that I was practicing ran out, I contacted the yoga studio, and they graciously allowed me to do some, work around the studio before classes started and after classes ended, so that I could take those yoga classes. And so it started there, and then eventually I was hired on as staff. So I would sign in and check people into class and do the administrative work in the background. And then eventually that led to me managing a yoga studio, a pretty popular yoga studio in the San Francisco Bay Area. And when I became a teacher, that was another shift as well. It was going from student to becoming a teacher. And all of that has been almost 11 years now of experience and understanding of how the industry operates, both as a practitioner, as a teacher, and also as a staff member. And so Embody Inclusivity was something that I decided to put together because I had many experiences very similar to lots of teachers of color and students of color who walk into yoga studios and are immediately feeling excluded. They feel like they don't fit in. They are facing a lot of microaggressions at the studio level from either the teachers or the management. And it's just not a space that is advertised to be sacred. Doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel very sacred to people of color. And so I decided to create something where I could create events and experiences that are inclusive, but that I could also really center people of color that are, leaders and experts in the industry that would otherwise get looked over. So it's Embody Inclusivity is really about representation, but way past representation. It's more so about feeling like there's a community that you can come to. And then it's also about uplifting BIPOC voices. So Black, Indigenous people of color can feel seen and heard. And that goes beyond representation, right? Because then we're starting to look into equity and what that looks like at the industry level. And really changing the narrative on who is deemed worthy for wellness and who is deemed worthy to have access to a yoga studio. So yeah, it was mostly out of my own personal experience within the last 11 years of being in the industry, but also through a lot of the conversations that I've had with other teachers of color in those 11 years that have, told me similar experiences to mine. And rather than continuing to have that in the background, I decided to put that in the forefront and make it a conversation and a discussion so that other people who don't hold our different intersectional identities can really start to get a sense of what it is that we're dealing with. And I do that in a number of different ways through Decolonizing Yoga and Wellness, which is really a conversation with BIPOC leaders in the industry about how we choose to decolonize the industry in really unique ways. But I also do that through events, workshops, trainings, online trainings, where I really collaborate heavily with a lot of BIPOC leaders so that they can really be in the forefront rather than in the background.
Such important work. And someone who has been a member of a couple of different yoga and wellness communities in Washington, D.C., in the Baltimore area, that is an experience that I have felt feeling on the margins and not feeling as though there's representation or even really an understanding or an interest in creating spaces that feel inclusive and feel inviting and safe for people of color to be a part of. And I think that that question that you raised, who is worthy of wellness, is such an important question for us to really be prioritizing, especially in this time of a global pandemic when wellness is on everyone's mind, but it's much more accessible to members of certain communities than of others. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to just get a bit of a glimpse into how this work really works and unfolds in the workshops and the trainings and the events that you hold, because building inclusive community can be really complex and really challenging work. And so I'm interested to hear, what are some of the most powerful lessons that this work has taught you, and how does it really unfold, particularly in spaces where people may not have a lot of familiarity or a comfort level with opening this kind of dialogue or having these conversations?
Yeah, totally. I think, what we do know are the statistics. So about, I can't remember if it's 90 or 95%, but a large majority of yoga studios are owned by predominantly white women. So the statistics really show that in just on the data level, on the facts, that the industry does look very monolithic. And so if we think of that one particularly racial group kind of owning the industry, then that's who it's really going to be tailored to. And because that's who they feel comfortable around. And that's the level of like experience, or not experience, but that's the level of perception that they're going to have. And so they're going to tailor their studios, or they're going to place their studios and locate them in areas where they are going to be predominantly a monolithic racial group. And that goes for teachers and students. And so if we kind of just take a look at the basic facts, then we can kind of see there is an issue. There is a problem with not just diversity, but also inclusion in general. And so when we take a look at the facts, then we start to go really deeper into the actual studio, the business ethics, the model, the way that capitalism kind of runs the industry. Then we start to take a look at a different problem, which is the lack of equity. So not only do you have a monolithic student base, you have a monolithic group of people who own the industry. There's going to be a huge lack of equity for people of color. And what we do know about, if we just take the United States, for instance, the United States is not a monolithic racialized country, right? It is very diverse. It is getting more diverse by the minute. And minorities are no longer the minority. We're actually the majority. So the industry does not actually reflect the actual facts of our existence. And so because we have this issue with a huge lack of self-awareness, even just within the industry itself, then we can start to tackle the problem. And I think that a lot of people think that this is not a problem that can be solved. What I say is that it is a problem that is very much fixable, but it takes a person to step outside of their comfort zone, specifically if they are, if they do identify as white. It takes them to kind of disassociate themselves from that mentality of, I am entitled to, doing things in a certain way, the way that I've been taught, the way that I've seen it done before, and really step away from oppressive business models. So it can be done, and I also feel like there are many people who can also fund and invest in people of color also opening up yoga studios and also opening up wellness centers, so that the industry doesn't look so monolithic. And really it comes down to that, is kind of stepping outside of what the dominant culture is saying at any given moment, and taking a look at how can I start to decolonize myself so that I can start to decolonize the industry. And everyone can do this no matter what your racial identity is. Decolonization is more so a mindset versus an identity. So I think what people predominantly mean when they say like, oh, this is really hard and challenging work, it's really more so a mental state, right? Like we have to really step outside of what we've been taught and what we've been told is the right way to do things, and start seeing, well, this quote unquote right way to do things is really excluding the majority of the population. And so how can we step outside of that so that we can now really start to see that diversity step into the room? And then can we be prepared for when that diversity steps into the room, specifically if you don't hold those diverse identities and those intersectional identities? Can you hold space for that? And can you really create that sacred space that you're so wanting to create for everybody and not just for a certain group of people? So the way that that looks like for Embody Inclusivity and our approach is really by starting to center people of color. So who are the teachers of color that are currently working at your studio? And if you have none, then there's your issue. And can we really start to elevate them and center them? What are the things that they want to be teaching? And asking our students of color, if you have any in your studio, what do they want to see and how do they want to be held? And once you start there, then things kind of start to unfold from there. Then we can start to really hire more diversely. Then we can start to bring in other teachers of color who travel that can also bring in that diversity. And then we can also start to create equity at the studio level, both for the students and the teachers, meaning that for the students, maybe we need to create more accessibility as far as our pricing models, as far as scholarships for yoga teacher trainings. And then at the teacher level, we really need to start making sure that it truly is equitable for the yoga teachers to be teaching in your space, especially if it's a predominantly white space. So there's those sorts of things that we really work on, but the mentality, the mindset is what we work on first. Before the action, we first have to understand, why have our spaces been so monolithic? And then how can we start to break out of that cycle in our own minds so that literally every single piece of action that we choose to do, whether it's in the hiring process or in the scholarship building, that we're doing it in the way that community wants to do it, rather than in that, saviorist way, the white saviorist way that says, I know better than you, I know exactly what you need, now you come to me. Yoga studios were always meant to be a community space, and so they really have to reflect community, and community has to be the voice. So that's kind of how we go about it. There's also online trainings that I do. So I really start to tackle from, it's predominantly a lot of yoga teachers that come to my trainings. And then they kind of invite their studio owners to be a part of it with them. But I do a lot of trainings because I really have to tackle this mindset that, well, I don't know why my classes aren't diverse, or I don't know why, I'm not seeing a lot of diversity within my friends group, for instance. That's a big one, is a lot of people don't even know people of color or have people of color as their friends. And statistically, we know that this to be the case, that 75% of white people only have white friends, versus Latinos, or for instance, someone who identifies as Black will have a very split friends group, 50% racialized and 50% white. So there is a huge problem within just society that we are self-segregating still, even though segregation has been outlawed. So we really have to tackle this mentality of, racism and prejudice and bias first, so that our spaces can really start to look diverse.
Yes, and I think that it's so important the way that you framed this conversation around decolonization, and that it is a mindset, and it's not just something that people of color can claim, but that white people need to begin to claim as well. And this is such complex and layered work, in that it is so woven into the relationships that we have in our lives more broadly, not just the relationships we have within our yoga studios and wellness communities. And so these conversations really have the opportunity to be peeling back the layers of how we are interacting and engaging throughout the course of our entire lives, and the biases and stories that we have inherited and absorbed and integrated throughout the course of our lives. And it takes a lot of intentional work
Yeah.
to begin to rebuild these systems and structures and communities in more inclusive ways.
Yeah.
And I'd love to also hear a bit more about your Women of Color Spill the Tea community and the conversations that you're having in that space and what you're learning there.
Yeah, so I lovingly call it woke spill the tea, just as a
Mm,
play on words. But
yes. Mhm.
woke spill the tea actually was a project that I held last year, that I am working on revamping and remolding it for 2020. But essentially, it's a panel discussion with different women of color that hold different sorts of identities. And we really talk about the different things that are affecting our community. So it can be anything from politics to pop culture to music and media, and social justice. So it's a conversation that I love to have with my own friends, you know, in the background. And I decided to just kind of bring it into the forefront as a panel discussion that other people can be a part of too. So last year it was something that I kind of did as like a underground podcast, I guess you could say. This year I'm really working on it becoming a podcast so that it's a lot more accessible and widely reached. But that is definitely a project that I love and definitely working on revamping this year.
Yes, so exciting. And for your community, I know that this must be a particularly challenging time, just considering how communities of color are being impacted by the virus, by this pandemic, in much more particular and much harsher ways. And I'm wondering how that has impacted the services that you offer and how you're showing up for your community during this time.
Yeah, definitely. So during this pandemic, a lot of yoga studios have had to close, if not all of them. And so typically yoga teachers of color will already have a hard time getting on the roster, meaning they're not getting as many classes as their white counterparts, and they're being paid less than their white counterparts. So you can imagine the studio closing altogether. It's going to create this really hectic and anxiety filled time where their teachers of color are really having to scramble and get really creative with how they continue to make their offerings so that they can still be paid. And so the way that I'm showing up for community there is to ensure that they have the tools that they need in order to create online offerings and really charge their worth for them, and also do it in an ethical way, because there are also a lot of people that show up online, as we know, that have really shaky moral ground and offer things that really aren't ethical. And so because we have these yogic principles that we like to follow in yoga, especially as teachers, I really like to remind people like to really stick to those. So one of the ways that I did that is I offered a free 1 hour workshop, really just showing my own process. And I don't deem to be an expert in this, but I did have my own virtual yoga studio a couple of years ago. I do have YouTube classes that you know, if you Google them, they're still up there. And so I do have that level of experience where I know how to show up online and I know how to charge for that. So that's kind of how I showed up for community, is giving teachers of color that free access. And then also currently working with my program Thrive, which is a group program, a virtual mentorship program for yoga teachers of color. My first cohort is about to graduate in a couple of weeks, which is really exciting. But yeah, and so Thrive is, you know, also having to be flexible and mold to the times. But what Thrive is all about is bringing teachers of color together to not only decolonize their mindsets, but for them to really figure out, how do I want to show up with community and for community? And how can I start to do these collaborations with other teachers of color so that we can really maximize our impact in the industry? And they can really start to be represented in the industry as well. So it's a group program that is having to mold and shift with the times a little bit, but my second cohort is going to be starting really soon, and I'm really focusing on how to really step outside of the studio, the yoga studio model, so that teachers feel like they're fully in control of not only what they offer, but they also have direct access to their students, rather than having the studio have direct access and then they get that that level of connection. So those are a few of the different things that I'm currently offering. And beyond that, I really want to focus on wellness practitioners as well. So I do work with different racialized groups, so whether that's BIPOC or the white community, but I really want to focus on wellness in general, not just the yoga studio level, because I think it's really important that other different wellness modalities are also being diverse and inclusive. And that can either be tarot, you know, spiritual practices like hoodoo, or it can, you know, just be people who just practice wellness in general. So I'm really working on expanding outside of my own community so that I can do that.
Incredible. And I loved how you were speaking about really connecting in with those yogic principles, and making sure that those allow you to maintain that integrity to your work and the way that you interact with your community. And I'm wondering if there are any yogic principles that are allowing you to really stay rooted and connected during this time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the lineage that I follow is through the Shivananda lineage. So we are Vedanta yogis, which is the philosophy that we follow. So Vedanta is expansive. It's really rich in a lot of wisdom and knowledge, and it takes a long time to really be able to get a good grasp on the philosophy in general. And sometimes it can be really complex. The basic principles that all yogis really aspire to follow are the 8 limbs of yoga, which is technically called the Ashtanga yoga system. And those 8 limbs are really about kind of like the do's and don'ts, if we're really kind of decompressing it, kind of the do's and don'ts. And one of the major principles that as a Shivananda yogi that I follow is seva and karma yoga. So that really is all about service and making sure that I am not just self-serving, but that I'm also serving community. And in the Western world, we don't necessarily have the luxury to be provided with a studio space by community so that we can give out free yoga classes. We're really dependent on community to fund us. So a lot of the different ways that I really follow those yogic principles is making sure that everything that I do that has a price tag attached to it also involves a level of some form of scholarship or accessible pricing, whether that's sliding scale, or, you know, if somebody contacts me and says, hey, I love what you're offering, but I really can't afford it, making sure that I have some form of accessibility for them. And that really goes down to that yogic principle of making sure that you are consistently thinking of community before, not necessarily before yourself, but making sure that it's not just about you. And then the other part of it is a lot of self-care as well. So making sure that I'm sharing these tools of self-care and liberation, that I'm sharing that with other people, so that it's not just about my liberation, but it becomes about collective liberation. And that goes beyond racial identity. But I think it's really important that specifically for people of color, that we understand that the yoga practice is a liberatory practice, and that if it doesn't feel like a liberating practice for you, then it's probably not yoga. So making sure that I'm really sharing what those liberatory philosophies are in yoga, but also self-care isn't a luxury, it's actually a necessity. And if you are, you can't continue to pour out from an empty cup. You have to make sure that you're nourishing yourself in whatever way that looks like for you. That it doesn't have to look like, going to a spa and spending hundreds of dollars. In fact, that's not what self-care is about at all. Yoga has been rich in its philosophy and making sure that, you're nourishing yourself, that it's a lifestyle, you're taking care of yourself, you're feeling good, you're meditating, your mind is clear, so that you can continue to support others. So those are kind of like just the very basic principles, and there are many more, but those are the ones that I really aspire to continue to put out there.
Yes, so aspirational. And I loved that piece where you were saying that if your practice doesn't feel liberatory, then it's probably not yoga.
Yeah.
Just something to be reflecting on for ourselves and getting curious. Is our practice really feeling liberatory for us? And if not, what kind of work can we begin to do to shift into a space where it does really feel liberatory for us?
Right.
And the piece about centering community alongside our self-care is also such an important message for this time, where we're thinking about, every day how our actions are impacting everyone around us, and really centering community care, which is that combination of healing and action, because we do need both.
Yeah.
And so I love to ask all of our guests what being more connected means to you.
Yeah, I think being more connected for me is definitely all about first feeling that sense of connection to myself. If I don't know who I am, or if I start to steer away from, who am I really in my core and in my essence and in my spirit, then it's going to be a lot harder for me to feel connected to other people. So in that sense, I really feel like it's important to know who you are, to have a lot of self-awareness, and to remember that, there's a practice, at least in what I study, where there's a meditation where you say, I am not the body, I am not the mind. And really that goes beyond like what I look like. Who I am is not what I look like, what I represent to society, or even my business. If all of those things were taken away, who I am is really spirit. Who I am is divinity. And that's what I want to see in other people as well. So when I see that in myself, I can feel a lot more connected to other people, and I can see their divinity, their creativity, their spirit. And that helps me continue doing this work that is challenging and emotionally draining at times. It helps me to remain connected to it. But it also just helps me to remember the humanity in people. So often our humanity is overlooked, and that can really start to kind of degrade our soul, and it really starts to make us feel like, other people don't have that same level of humanity as we do. So when I see the humanity in myself, I can also see it in others, and that's really important to me, to make sure that I feel connected to the humanity within myself, so that I see it in other people as well.
And I think that is such an incredible message for us to begin to wrap up around. Just knowing that it's unfortunate that we live within a culture and a society that often doesn't place our humanity at the center, but that is such an important part of all of our soul's work, is being able to really love on and honor and recognize and see our own humanity, and to be able to recognize and honor and love and see that in each other.
Yeah.
And so thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing in the world. And I'd love for you to share with our community how they can stay connected with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So on Instagram is usually where I show up and give free resources and education. So you can find me at eliana.chinea, and I'm sure you'll have the spelling for all of that somewhere close by.
Absolutely.
And you can also sign up for my newsletter on my website, embodyinclusivity.com. And that's where you can really start to get first access to any of the programs that I'm putting out there, or any conferences that I'll be at, or any events that I'll be putting together. And then I also launched my Patreon community. So that's where you can really, really start to get connected and really start to support. You can support for as little as $5 if you like. And that's where I'll be providing the most amount of education, for a really accessible price. So on Patreon, it's patreon.com/Constanza Eliana.
Wonderful. And you have a free gift for this community as well. So I'd love if you could share a little bit about the free gift and how it can support people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I created a self-care planner last year, really for myself, just so I can kind of keep up with things on my own. And then I decided to share it with community. So it's a pretty easy to print planner. It has daily pages, weekly pages, and yearly pages that you can fill out. It's all undated, so you really get to customize it to yourself. And if you're like me and you have a happy planner, you can hole punch it and put it in your happy planner. It can be part of your daily routine. So the self-care planner has a bunch of different sections in it, particularly in the daily page, where you can really keep track of your wellness along with your to-dos as usual. So hopefully it can support people in that way.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all the wisdom that you shared during our conversation. And I'm so excited for this community to be able to stay connected with you.
Yes, same. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you. Have a great one.
You too.